Hi, I'm John. Welcome to Edgestone Studios. And today I'm going to talk about the most amazing analog console from the 80s that you've never heard of. Unless you've been following my channel, then you've heard all about it. Well, most of it. So let's get to it. So, of course, the console I'm talking about is the Sony MCI MXP-3036 or 3000 line of consoles from 1985 on through the mid-90s. These were produced by Sony, but originally designed by MCI, and they have a kind of fascinating history. They seem to have been a little bit lost to time in terms of people knowing about them. I'm sure people in the industry who were active at the time or who are really into researching analog consoles know all about them. But everybody knows Neve consoles, everybody knows SSL, everybody knows API, but nobody thinks Sony consoles. And when I came across this ad in our local Facebook marketplace for this large format console that was by Sony, I started doing some research. I talked to a friend of mine, Ian, and he convinced me I had to buy this console. I kind of convinced myself. I kind of saw this thing as just something I had to do. So I picked it up, restored it, which you can see in my full series on restoring the console. And ultimately chose not to use it in my studio, but I learned a lot about it, and I'm pretty fascinated by kind of its place in history and where it ended up in terms of people knowing about it. So during the restoration process, I talked to a lot of console owners. I found at least 30 plus studios in the world that use these Sony consoles still today. I learned a lot about the history of MCI and the Sony acquisition and this particular console itself. And now I know the ins and outs of the console. So I thought I would give an overview of the history of the console and what's unique about it, and where it stands today in terms of how does it stand up against other consoles as far as I know. So from what I could tell, a lot of this from Wikipedia, MCI was formed in the mid-60s by Grover Jeep Harned, and Grover had been running a stereo repair business, and he branched out to help studios with their gear, and that turned out to be a fortuitous situation for him because he did a great job and people kept wanting him to build things for them. So eventually he formed MCI and introduced the JH400 console, which was the first commercial inline console. So by inline, for those of you who don't know, consoles will have a channel strip that comes in from the mic or line inputs that get processed through EQs and that with the fader and get sent to the mix, or they could get sent to a bus. So the bus system would be the place that you would sum up multiple channels and then send it to the out to the tape recorder. And when you want to play back, you would listen back through a separate set of faders that were and channels that were just for the listen back, for the lines coming back in. So an inline console takes the idea of one channel strip and puts the mic pre's and or line inputs that you're recording with in the same channel as the returns from your tape machine, or nowadays a DAW. So this was innovative in the 70s, and obviously every console manufacturer ended up doing this, but MCI was sort of first out of the gate. And along the way, Dave Harrison of Harrison Consoles was also working for MCI and helped design some of these products. And eventually, MCI grew quite a reputation for being amazing consoles that were a lot cheaper than Neve's, APIs, SSLs, etc. They were made in Florida. They were U.S. made. And they had a competitive edge in terms of being able to sell below what other companies were selling their consoles for. So by the time the 80s were hitting, Sony and Philips were creating the standard for the compact discs, the Redbook standard. And MCI was one of several major manufacturers, of course, that backed this new digital recording technology and standard. So in early 80 the early 1980s, Sony was looking to break into the U.S. manufacturing market. So they approached MCI with an offer and bought MCI and moved their professional products division to Fort Lauderdale to produce professional audio equipment. And at that point in time, MCI had already been developing what would become the MXP-3000 series of consoles. So this was an MCI designed console that Sony came in and applied Sony manufacturing technology to one, reduce the cost, two, sort of automate the build process, because of course Sony had major manufacturing capabilities in Japan. So the combination of the two made for less expensive but high quality console that broke onto the market in 1985. And my particular console was built either late 85 or early 86 and sold to the BCTV, British Columbia Television Corporation, who was a local broadcaster, and we would watch BCTV News, etc. And it was sold to them in 86, and also in 1986, Expo was happening in Vancouver. So this was the World Fair. Everybody was coming to Vancouver. It completely changed the face of Vancouver, and probably is one of the main reasons why Vancouver has become such an unaffordable market today, because the world came to Vancouver and they never left. It changed the cityscape, etc. And BCTV featured a broadcast booth at Expo inside their pavilion, and they ran the news and other programming right out of the Expo broadcast booth, where the public could come in and see what was going on. And this console premiered in that booth. I was there in 86. I had moved to Vancouver in 1984 to go to BCIT, British Columbia Institute of Technology for Computer Science. And after a year, I had dropped out and formed a band with some friends and was living in a band house with 4 other guys. And that lasted 6 months for me before I couldn't stand that situation. And I moved out and figured out a way to get going on my music career by going to music school. So I was, in the summer of 86, going to Vancouver Community College, taking theory courses in order to apply to get in for the fall program for 86. And my parents bought me a ticket to Expo 86. So I was there pretty well every weekend, at least hanging around. I didn't have a lot of money, so I couldn't really spend on a lot. But I remember going into that pavilion, never once thinking that one day the console that was sitting there would be mine, or not even thinking that I'd be into audio engineering as a profession. So it had a kind of unique connection to me in the sense that I was there, I saw it. That was around the time I got into audio, and ended up now sitting out in my garage fully restored. Anyways, the MXP 3000 series of consoles came in 3 different formats. There was a 20 channel chassis, a 36 channel chassis, and a 56 channel chassis. So these were known as the MXP 3020, 3036, and 3056. And from what I can tell, although the quality was amazing, these didn't end up in a lot of recording studios. They ended up primarily in broadcast studios. And of the consoles that I was tracking down that are existing today, at least 5 of them came from CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Mine came from BCTV, which is also broadcasting, and several others that I tracked down came from American broadcast institutions. And from what I can tell, the reason for that was, at this point in time, the early 80s, studios formats had moved from 16-channel recording to 24-channel recording, and now in some cases 48-channel by slaving to 24-track units together, tape machines. So the channel counts were growing, and 36 channels was not considered sufficient anymore for a new recording studio. So although the console was pretty amazing, the placement in recording studios around the world was lower than the broadcast studios. But the Sony product had such a clean sound that broadcast studios picked it up like crazy because compared to other consoles, it was cheap. I estimate that the one I have in my garage originally cost about $150,000 US for that model. That was a stock model, but fully loaded with all the channels filled and all the main modules in the master section. So what can I tell you about the MXP-3000 or 3036 consoles? Well, it's probably the quietest console ever built in its size range. It's got oxygen-free copper wiring. It's got amazingly good circuit connections. And it was incredibly modular. Of course, the channels were modular. You could pull them out and move them around. But each of the EQ sections came with 5 different module options. There were 4 different Sony preamp options as well. There were third-party preamp and EQ options. There were 3 different metering systems, so you could get the VU meters as a standard. That was probably typical. Peak program meters, PPM. They had a black background on them. And there was also a vacuum fluorescent display, which is basically a segmented, what we'd now call an LED segmented meter, but it wasn't LEDs, it was fluorescent back then. You could get it with 2 different levels of automation. It was one of the early consoles, or MCI at least, developed one of the first consoles with voltage-controlled amplifiers, or VCA, as an alternative to motorized faders. So basically, you could use a voltage to control the volume of the amplifier and send signals for muting or unmuting channels, allowing for automation of the system. There was an automation system available. Mine came with that, although it didn't come with the computer. This was a Sony design system. It's an old, it's got to be an 8086 computer, 5.5-inch floppy disk, dumb terminal connection, a little keypad that rolled on the console for typing in commands. And apparently it worked like crap. According to the designer, Tom Graff, on the forums, he said the thing never worked. When I got mine, I read that you could write to tape, and I was thinking, ooh, I could write automation to the DAW and then just automate using the DAW. And he said there was only one company in the world, and it was in Japan, I think he said, or somewhere in Asia, that even managed to get that system working. So it never worked either. And then J.L. Cooper made a replacement automation system, and it was a Macintosh-driven software that apparently worked a bit better, but the automation apparently was never really that great. The console also came with both transformer and transformerless options. Mine was transformerless. A few of the replacement channels I got had transformers, but you could have an output transformer as well. My understanding was that broadcast tended to get transformers, and I'm not quite sure what that's about. Someone can say in the comments. What else can I say about it? Sony also developed its own hybrid integrated circuits for critical components like the differential amplifiers needed for the active mic preamps and portions of the master channel. So my understanding is, first of all, these things last forever. They were epoxy-coated circuits for a lot of them. And sure, they can eventually die and will eventually die, but here it is 35, 40 years later. Mine are all working. The only ones you have to really worry about are the master module because they're not really replaceable. There are other options for the mic preamps, and obviously there are more mic preamps available on the secondhand market than there are master modules. So let's talk about the preamps that they had. So the stock preamp was a single channel transformerless mic pre using this new hybrid. It went from 15 to 35 dB in the low setting and 30 to 65 dB in the high, had the phantom power, etc. So that was the 131. The 132 was basically 2 of these, an A or B switchable mic pre in one channel. And this was really set up as a backup situation. If your one mic pre went, you could switch to the other one. So I think these are probably pretty rare. They made a 133, which was a transformer isolated preamp using Jensen JE115 transformer. Obviously, phantom power. It was 40 dB of gain and a 20 dB pad on that one. Then there was the 134, which was a 2-channel AB instant switch version of the 133. So the fifth preamp was a line level preamp. So you didn't even need a mic preamp to use the line input, but you could put a line level preamp in there that basically let you have a dual line coming into the channel. So it also featured a 10 dB trim on it. So really they had 2 preamps and then 2 double preamps and then a line preamp that made the line input be double the line input. So it kind of was only 2. But on top of that, API made a version of their 212 preamp. So this is a classic API preamp, that came from the API 2488 series consoles and had that famous LA sound. And API are wonderful preamps. So these are still available on the second-hand market. So it's the 212S, S for Sony. John Hardy also makes a preamp. He still makes it, the MPC-3000 preamp. And this is a Jensen JT16B transformer preamp with 990C discrete Class A op-amp in the circuit, and it has no coupling capacitors in the signal path, so it's supposed to be amazing sounding. A lot of people look for these consoles. Avalon made a preamp for it, so it made the M3 Pure Class A mono microphone preamp, which was twin cascaded 100% discrete bipolar amplifiers. Whatever that means. I kind of know what it means, but you electronics guys will know better than me exactly what this means. But it's supposed to have very high definition signature, as well as rich low and mid range harmonics in this. There's another fellow that builds these Normaphone MXP LC1s, and these are a Lundell 1538XL transformer-based preamp with low distortion, DC servo, drives up to 600 ohm loads. So those are supposed to be quite good as well. And then there's a last one I found, which is JLM Audio makes a dual 99V3000 mic pre, which uses 2 of their discrete 99V op amps and a 2-stage gain path and gives 66 dB of gain. So tons of mic pre's available for this console, and you can mix and match. Each channel could have whichever one you own or can want to put in there. When it came to equalizers, there were 5 factory equalizer options. In this case, there really were 5 different equalizer options, not dual equalizers like the mic pre's, where there really were only 2 equalizer factory options. So the standard EQ is the EQ31 from Sony, which is what mine has in it. And that's a 4-band sweepable semi-parametric unit. And that's because it's got a fixed Q of 1.5. And the top and low bands are both shelving and have buttons for peak as well. So you can change them into peak EQs instead of shelving EQs. They made an EQ32, which is basically the same wine EQ as the 31, but each of the 4 bands had a switchable Q that switched between, I don't know what, a tighter and a wider Q on each band, but I don't know what the specs were for the second Q on the band. They made an EQ33, and this was a completely continuously variable Q, fully parametric EQ. And from everything I've read, this was the worst of the EQs. Most of the people don't like them, and they were made because some company or other that was buying these units pressured Sony into making one available because they wanted fully parametric, and apparently they weren't as good of a design as the other ones. So from what I've read, this is all hearsay. I've never used them myself. They also made the EQ34, and this was a fixed frequency selectable inductor EQ. So pretty cool, because there weren't a lot of fixed frequency EQs coming out in consoles at that point in time. So it let you choose between different frequencies in each of the bands, and then had a plus or minus frequency boost or cut for each of those bands. So these are real wire inductor EQs. And lastly, Sony made the EQ-35, which was a 10-band center frequency graphic style EQ in a single module. So it was, each band was a little rotary knob for up or down for that particular frequency. So kind of cool to have graphic EQs in a board as well. Again, API also made a version of their famous 550 equalizer, the 550S for the Sony products. So you can get, if you were lucky, get a 36-channel Sony board and fill it out with all API EQs and all API preamps. That'd be amazing. But the Sony preamps are clean and they sound wonderful. So, as well, Avalon made something called the E3 Pure Class A Mono Music Equalizer Module. So this was an exclusive combination of active and passive EQ filters. Apparently has high transient detail, blah, 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 blah. But Avalon make amazing gear as well. So there's Avalon available ones. So on top of those 7 potential EQs that you might buy and the multiple preamps, each of the channels also has an independent low-pass filter and high-pass filter switchable. And those filters, the low-pass filter is variable, I believe between 20 and 320 hertz. High-pass filter is fixed at 10K. But the filter section is switchable in and out of the channel or the monitor section, same as the EQs themselves. And all of the EQs were completely bypassable. There's a button on the console to completely bypass the EQ section, and that's a true bypass. What were the other features of the console? Well, it had 6 auxiliary sends, 4 mono and 1 stereo. It had an integrated patch bay for all the patch points on the channels themselves, as well as patch bays for the sends and returns, tape returns, and then however many hundreds of pieces of external gear you connected to this thing. I think the patch bay points are over 500 patch bay points between 36 channels and the rest of the master section. It was a true inline design. So as I said, you had a channel path, which is your microphone typically coming in, and a monitor path, which is your tape return or your DAW return coming in. Independent faders for each, which are switchable. So there's a switch on them to switch between the big fader being for the monitor section or the big fader being for the channel section. The EQs and switch filters are also switchable between the monitor or channel section and independently. So you can put the EQ on the channel section and the filter on the monitor section, or vice versa, or put them both on the same. It was designed for 24-channel tape recording, so it has a 24-channel bus network, or active control network as they call it, ACN. And all 36 channels could be routed. Any of those 36 channels could be routed to any of those 24 buses, but each of those 36 channels also has its own direct out. So technically in a modern DAW setting, you could set up with 36 direct out to 36 channels simultaneously from this console, or a combination of 24 routed channels and another 12 direct. It's got dump and bus buttons that allow the line-ins to be dumped to different parts of the bus network. So you could take a line in coming in on 2 and dump that back out to 5 and have it go right back out line out 5. So this would be used in the analog tape times to take some channels and bounce them down onto other tracks cleanly. So just going through the network, not going through the channel strips themselves. It's got the ability to have audio group masters. So rather than having a set of bus faders, you could designate a fader or channel to be a group master, and you could assign channels to that active control network and then make that fader, fader be the master for that bus. So there's a reverse switch to switch between channel or monitor returns when you're listening. It's got a built-in oscillator section that can generate white noise, pink noise, and then frequencies from 20 to 20,000 hertz. Built-in talkback mic that could be sent to up to 4 destinations. So my console has the podium is one of the things you can wire up. It could be whatever, but it's set as a podium, studio monitors, direct to tape or to the headphone feed. There's a pre-fader listen bus. There's a solo bus, of course. And then in the monitor module, you've got the ability to listen to tape returns, listen to the auxiliaries, listen to the mono mix, listen to the 2 mix, listen to the auxiliary ins, and you can do that either for on the control room monitors or the studio monitors. Each of those are selectable. Any source could be mono. There's a phase reverse to mono for whatever you're listening to. You can mute the left or right speakers. There's a solo trim to set your solo level. Obviously studio levels and studio mute buttons and control room levels and control room dim buttons. So fully featured. But on top of that, there were extra options you could get. So you could get, which I don't have, a headphone amplifier that took up a module slot so that you could have headphones coming right out of the console. There were wild faders, which basically were faders that could be used for, they came as particular packages. I think they came as 4 per package, and you had to buy the specific package. So 1 to 4 was a certain package wired a certain way. 5 to 8 was another package. And wild faders were basically faders that could act like group faders or control things like direct inputs into the 2 mix from the patch bay. You could use wild faders to control that, my understanding is. So that's really the overview of the console. But the more fascinating thing to me is how much people praise these consoles from the people I've talked to. So I've talked to some studio owners all over the Midwest of the US, locally here on the West Coast. They all talk about how amazing this console sounds. And I've got this email from Bob Holbrook, and I'd like to read what he said to me. He said I could share this story because I thought it was so fascinating. So Bob said this. He sent me this email and it said, "John, you've got this. Awesome to hear your approach. Your SSL pre's are great. I've used them. And you'll find the console itself sounds much like an SSL. The, I think, 4000 series was designed much like the 3036. And Bob goes on to say, "My story with the console is that I got to work on a Neve V3 at Skywalker Ranch, which blew me away. I'd heard so many negatives, and it was awesome. So I set my sights on buying one. Sure enough, within a few years, I got word that one was for sale just 50 miles from me. I went to see it and the original owner, and it was pristine. The owner had a huge facility with several recording and mixing rooms. He told me he was dumping all of his analog consoles for digitals, and that was the catch. To buy the Neve V3, I had to buy all of the consoles he was dumping. They included 2 other Neve, or 8100 series, MCI 636, a huge Yamaha, don't remember the model, MCI Sony MXP-3000, and more. I ended up offering my top dollar for the Neve V3, and I got all of the consoles. Since I already had a Neotech A1E and a Trident 75 series, my collection was vast, to say the least. Quickly, I had the Neve V3, 11-foot, 60 channels, up and running, and it was great. And while in the warehouse, we cleaned and evaluated each and every console. One night, my 2 engineers finished and cleaned up and decided to run test audio through each of the consoles, monitoring on bookshelf monitors with a CD player and Alison Krauss CD that they did their tests. Channels 1 and 2 on each console, no EQ, just straight and raw out of the master. It was later that night, about 9:30, when they called to tell me I had to come to the warehouse that moment to hear the most amazing console they had ever heard. And you guessed it, with all the others to compare, the MCI Sony 3000 series blew everyone out of the water. There was no comparison. Nothing. All the consoles sounded world-class, but the 3000 was above them all. And then he goes on to say the whine EQs with the Q-width switch sound like angel dust. They're what I've always heard as musical. I filled up the vacant slots strip by strip and haven't looked back." And like I say, it's pretty well the same story I've heard from other console owners. I've talked to a few people who are going to sell their console. They saw me fixing mine up and they got inspired to just get theirs working again because they were having some issues with theirs. And Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate that my studio isn't about 10% bigger. I think that's all it would take for me to not feel like it was too big for this space. But I'm back to my Presonus board. I'm back to SSL 6CH preamps. I'm going to pick up a couple more pre's. I've got a little bit more outboard geared now just because of the way I've reorganized things. And I'm going to miss the Sony, but mine's up for sale. This is not an ad for the console in the sense of come buy my console. This was just, I'd learned so much and felt I really needed to share something about this console and kind of wrap up because I couldn't find this information when I was looking for it to know about the Sonys. So that's basically what I've learned. Hopefully I've covered most of it. I hope you found it interesting, and maybe you can, well, I think the last thing I want to say is I think these consoles are a steal. Like, I put over $6,000 of money into mine to get it to the point where it was purchased and working, and so much time. So I'm asking quite a bit more than that because of all the effort I put into it and that it is fully working. But I've seen them going for between 3 to 20,000. When you look at a 36-channel API, Neve, or SSL console from the 80s, you're going to be paying 4 to 10 times that much. So if it's that amazing sounding, I think it's the deal of the century on big, large format analog consoles that are hugely customizable and pretty unique. And from what I could tell, listening to it in here, it sounded great. It really did. I just wish I'd gotten to mix through it, but I wasn't going to recable everything just to get to the point of mixing through it, and it would have been a lot of recabling, so resoldering. So anyways, that's my update on the Sony MXP-3036 line of consoles that were also from MCI, last console MCI ever produced. And I hope you enjoyed it. That's probably the last of my analog console video days. So go watch my other videos if you haven't already. Thanks for watching my channel. Thanks for subscribing. I don't encourage people to subscribe because I figure subscribe to what you want to subscribe to. You'll see me pop up now and then. If you want to watch my videos, watch them. And I'm not sponsored by anybody, including Sony or MCI, which doesn't exist anymore. Anyways, thanks for watching. We'll see you later.